From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today's podcast is our annual year-in-review special, so we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. We'll be breaking the program up into segments and hearing from a number of different scholars from across MEI to get their take on the year's major events and trends. First up on the program, I'll be talking to Paul Salem, MEI's president. Paul, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Well, let's start with a sort of 30,000-foot view of the region. Where do things stand in the Middle East as 2021 draws to a close?
Well, I mean, the big picture in the region maybe systematically remains that it was a year of dealing with an ongoing pandemic and all the stresses and strains that creates in the region. The region is very uneven in its dealing with the pandemic. Some countries have gotten well ahead of it, like some of the countries in the Gulf. Others have not. Vaccination rates in the bigger, poorer countries remain very low. It remains a major concern of governments and peoples in the region. It's put enormous strain on the public finances, deficits, and debts of the countries that are not as wealthy as some of the richer ones. But having said that, I think generally the states in the region have dealt in a generalized sense reasonably well given their resources. There's still a desperate need for more vaccines, and those should come from the U.S. and more wealthy countries. The average growth in the economy was about 4% in 2021. And that's after almost a 4% contraction last year. So a difficult year, and the pandemic doesn't seem to be behind us yet, so that will continue to be a concern. On the 30,000 sort of foot level, some very big events were the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a new administration in the US, elections in Iran, new government in Israel. Those were sort of specific incidents that we can come back to.
Let's drill down in that in a little bit more detail on the year's most important developments. What stood out to you and what also kind of surprised you the most?
Well, you might say the most important development was regime change in Washington in the sense that you had a new administration in Washington. The U.S. remains probably the biggest player in the Middle East. And when you look at what that meant, it has meant some change in some areas, but continuity in others. The big change really was the decision to withdraw and the implementation of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the disastrous way in which that decision was implemented. And, we could go back to what all of that means. The new administration, brought in a new policy, an attempt to forge a new policy with Iran to get back into the nuclear deal. But unlike on the decision with Afghanistan, that, wish from the Biden administration or decision has not borne fruit. So in a way, the Biden administration at the end of its first year in office, in a way, still continues Trump's policy in the sense that we're still under maximum pressure, and attempts to return to the nuclear deal have not borne fruit. On other U.S. policy issues that are very significant to the region, we've seen, I would say, more continuity than change. That relates to relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, have pretty much continued despite a few tensions here and there. Relations with the new government of Israel, no major change there, no major change with Egypt and so on. So a lot of continuity and a little bit of change, but a big one is Afghanistan. So that I would say is a big one. Obviously, we did mention some other changes. New government in Iran, the main government remains, the Supreme Leader, Revolutionary Guards, those haven't changed. But maybe that change in Iran, that could be the reason or part of the reasons why talks with the Biden administration did not bear fruit, at least not in 2021. The change of government in Israel and the at least temporary, maybe permanent, end of Netanyahu's career leading Israel, that hasn't borne any dramatic fruit yet, but that is a big change. The Abraham Accords were concluded before this year, but they are continuing to shape events in the region.
On the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, I just wanted to kind of circle back to that as one of the year's biggest developments. What do you see as the sort of longer-term regional implications of that move?
I think a lot will depend on what happens in Afghanistan. Obviously, there was a number of immediate things. One was concern from players in the region, the impression that it's leaving the region, that it's not up to any sustained presence or sustained fight. I would say that's a misunderstanding. The decision to withdraw from Afghanistan That was attempted by Obama, attempted by Trump. Biden has been saying it all along. But I would say a lot of people in the region interpreted it as part of an overall pattern. Whereas I would say, the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was a decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, not to withdraw from the region. Secondly, obviously, it's a big, at least initially, a big victory for the Taliban, obviously, but also for radical Islamic extremist violent groups, including Al Qaeda and ISIS, who would interpret this as a historic defeat of the great Satan, the great superpower. It would encourage extremist groups to be more hopeful, more tough. I think it encourages Iran to be more tough. So it has those kinds of repercussions. It has immediate also humanitarian repercussions, which might lead to refugee flows in the coming weeks. Right now, there's a growing famine that could turn into refugee flows. That could impact countries in the region. Could impact Pakistan more, and some of those refugees could end up maybe in Europe. So it could have repercussions. That's not happening immediately. In the medium term, I think it depends what happens politically in Afghanistan. Question A, can the Taliban actually consolidate their hold on Afghanistan and govern it? If so, will they govern it and will they be more, let's say, pragmatic, less extremist? And if so, they might become more normalized players in the region. Or, option B is they're not able to control Afghanistan and Afghanistan sinks into, various forms of civil conflict that creates opportunities for ISIS and Al Qaeda to set up their own operations there. That's a different scenario. Or a Taliban could, choose to go back to a more extremist position and, more alliances with groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. So I think the jury's still out on that.
Resolving the region's civil wars has been a major focus for you in your work, and I'm just curious, do you have any kind of takeaways on that front? Has there been any significant movement there that you think is noteworthy?
Well, there has been movement in Libya, I would say, and that started in 2020. It's continued in 2021. There still are supposed to be elections next week in Libya, but they're looking like they're going to be postponed. But I would say Libya, in 2021 has made civil war ending progress. And there's been several tracks on the economic, political, and military track. Very, very tenuous. It might still completely fall apart. And we'll have to see in early 2022 if this continues to move forward. But that Libya has shown hope. Yemen has not. The Houthis basically have refused to negotiate or compromise. They're intensely focused with support from Iran in taking the city of Marib. And that is being resisted by government and tribal and local groups there with support from Saudi Arabia. So that's an ongoing battle. And despite numerous attempts to bring the Houthis to the negotiating table, initiatives by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by the UN, it's clear the Houthis are more focused on making more military gains. Either then they will just keep, maybe declare northern Yemen as their new state, or continue to take the fight to what used to be called southern Yemen, in Shabwa and other cities, and continue the war. So no progress in Yemen. In Syria, it's really a frozen conflict. There's been no major battles, and that's a good thing. But there's also been zero progress towards resolution of the political impasse, the political division. Things are, what they were at the beginning of the year. So no progress there. The only development which is significant is a number of Arab countries are beginning to open up to the Assad regime. There's talk of potentially trying to bring them back into the Arab League. The UAE sent their foreign minister to Damascus as part of an opening. So there is an opening from a number of Arab countries to the Assad regime. I don't think that'll change the status quo and the sort of frozen civil war in Syria, but it might have other effects.
One final big picture question for you before we wrap up. As 2021 concludes, do you think you're more optimistic or more pessimistic about things than you were as the year began?
Strangely enough, I might say I'm a bit more optimistic in the long term. And here's why. I think the COVID pandemic has indicated to governments around the region, and I would say around the world, but around the region in particular, that they have to focus on systemic, long-term challenges. Pandemic is a good example where the enemy is not some other country or some other sect or some other tribe, but it's something more systemic. It's something that is not related to sort of traditional rivalries and conflicts. I think that's a healthy orientation for governments and governance to have. And it very much orients governments, hopefully, towards looking at other systemic issues like climate change and things of that nature, as well as poverty and things that are systemic, that are not traditional enemies. I take some sort of positive orientation from that. I do think that the Biden administration brought a less confrontational, sort of more diplomatic approach to things. And I think that's been mirrored by diplomacy in the region. There's talks between the Gulf countries and Iran happening in Baghdad. UAE has, as I said, sent envoys. I mean, after the Abraham Accords, there was an opening to Assad, for better or for worse, but that is diplomacy. More significantly, maybe there's been an opening between the UAE and Turkey. There is more talks between the UAE and Iran. There's a recognition that, war, conflict, confrontation is really not going to solve anything, but it's going to make things worse. So some indicators that there might be some hope. I don't want to, be a Pollyanna. Things in the Middle East, in many parts of the Middle East, are horrible and not getting better. One would cite Yemen, Syria, Lebanon continues to take a turn for the worse. We still face systemic problems of large populations, higher unemployment. Things have gotten, worse during the pandemic in terms of poverty and unemployment in the bigger countries. So don't get me wrong, things are bad and maybe getting worse, but I think there's some positive orientations in governance, domestically, regional governance, and even, I dare say, in an attempts at better international governance, even though we haven't seen much progress yet.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you so much for joining us today, Paul.
Thank you, Alistair. Have happy holidays and hopefully a good 2022.
Next up on the program, I'll be talking to Randa Slim, Senior Fellow at MEI and Director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Randa, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, and good to be here, Alistair.
Randa, what do you see as the key developments and trends in the Middle East this year?
In my field, looking at conflicts and conflict resolution, I see two trends. I see one trend basically is about a conflict system that has been protracted and is likely to stay with us for the foreseeable future. And this conflict system includes Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and increasingly Palestine, of course, and increasingly including Lebanon. And it has had tremendous and enormous humanitarian consequences on the region, including the proliferation of non-state actors, armed actors, terrorist groups. We also are seeing new conflicts entering in the mix in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea. We are seeing new forms of warfare being used, including drones, cyber. We have seen a setback to whatever democratic transformation have taken place in the past, but also recently, Sudan and Tunis. And we have a sustained pattern of military escalation between Israel and Iran. And you add to that all the global threats which impact regional security, from climate change to resource scarcity, pandemics, and superpower competition in the region. Now, on the positive side, the good side of the story, so it's a half full, half empty kind of story. On the second side, which is half full, we have seen, and in my opinion is going to continue next year, a momentum toward de-escalation and conflict reduction that is gaining traction. We have seen rapprochement, especially in the intra-GCC space with the resolution of the Qatar crisis. We have seen rapprochement between the UAE and Iran, UAE and Turkey, 4 dialogues between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the Abrahamic Accords gaining even more strength. And we are seeing also potential improvement in the relationship between Egypt and Turkey. Now, the second part of the story, of course, is going to be affected by what happens in Vienna with the talks around the restoration of the JCPOA. If those talks were to fail, and it looks like they might, I hope, for a miracle in the end, and the parties will come to some kind of a resolution agreement on restoration of the JCPOA. If those talks were to fail, I think this is going to impact the conflict or the escalation. And it's not going to throw the region into warfare, because I truly believe that this regional de-escalation that's being led by regional powers, primarily UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, I think is here to continue because it is in the interest of these countries, and they are doing it for their own needs and interests, and not necessarily in response to any kind of directive from the Americans or any other extra-regional power.
Randa, I wanted to drill down on the issue of the Vienna talks in a little bit more detail. As you said, the prospects of a deal seem to be kind of steadily dwindling day by day. What's your read specifically on that situation, and where do you see things going moving forward?
I mean, what I'm reading is what I think a lot of your listeners are reading and what you are reading, which is, what we are hearing in tweets from some of the participants in these talks, in reporting from journalists who have access to participants in the talk. Looks like the gap between the Iranian position on one hand and the position of the other, P4 plus one, the gap is so large that as of today, there doesn't seem to be a common ground, in the offing that people seem to be heading toward. There is an interest and will, in my opinion, on all sides. I truly believe that the Iranians want to reach a deal, but they want to reach a deal on their terms. And their terms are not going to be acceptable to the other participants, particularly to the Americans. And so will this gap be bridged? I don't know. I mean, negotiators usually can be creative if they feel that they are reaching a point of no return, and we might see some concession making, some compromise taking place. But as of now, the gap is so large that I think it's going to be hard to bridge it.
I suppose this is the million-dollar question, but if the talks fail, what's plan B?
I don't know, because, many, even officials in the region, right now I'm speaking with you from Lebanon, many officials in the region have been asking the Americans, what is your plan B? And I think they have yet to hear a clear answer from the American side about the American plan B. I guess it's going to be, sanctions. I think it's going to be U.S. effort to bring the international community around sanctions, because right now, remember, the sanction regime, does not have the kind of international support and consensus around it, especially from the Russians and the Chinese, that the Obama administration was able to put together and then forced, in fact, the Iranians to make the concession that were needed because of this consensus in the international community around the sanctions. I think right now the sanction regime is leaking. It's not a solid sanction regime, and it doesn't seem like the Chinese and the Russian are on board with the US when it comes to enforcement of these sanctions going forward. So I think the sanctions will continue, but also there will need to be for US diplomacy to persuade the Chinese and the Russians to come together with the Americans and the Europeans to, bring enough of a pressure on the Iranians for them to eventually make the kind of concession that are needed. But again, I think the deal itself, seems to be, becoming an empty shell, given the advances that Iran have made since 2018, when the United States pulled out of the deal, in terms of centrifuge, in terms of the amount and the percentage of highly enriched uranium. So in a way, the deal itself is being hollowed out by the Iranian moves. And so the question is, if the deal is not struck within, very short period, the deal itself no longer is valid as it was structured in 2015. And there need to be new terms for the deal, given where Iran is again in terms of the advances in its nuclear power research as well as production.
You touched on this briefly earlier, but how do you think a failure of talks will shape the actions of regional actors?
Look, I think the regional actors are, especially I'm talking about actors in the Gulf, I think there are three things that are driving this de-escalation momentum, particularly the moves toward some talks and détente, perhaps short-term détente, or a pause in the conflict cycle that existed until recently between, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And I think it's driven by one, fear of Iranian actions, and they have seen the consequences of Iranian action in 2019 when they attacked oil installations, and the capacities of the Iranian regime at striking heavy blows, not only against oil installation, but we have seen it also against Al-Assad base in Iraq following the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. So there is fear. There is fear of Iranian action and what Iran will do, in case the talks fail, and trying to basically create a buffer between them and the US so that they don't have to pay the price for the failures of these talks and the pressures that's going to follow the failure as far as the American side is concerned. Two, I think there is definitely domestic reasons. I mean, the region, the people of the region, the countries, the leadership is tired of war, is tired of conflict. And there are now domestic priorities having to do with, managing energy transition challenges, with, digital economy, creating their workforce and the people for an era when hydrocarbons will no longer be the driver of their economies. So I think they have domestic reasons for wanting to put more of their resources internally and not on waging conflicts, either through proxies or directly, with countries like Iran. And then three, there is this perception that they need to come to an modus vivendi with Iran, particularly because the US security umbrella that they used to rely on to protect them or to provide them some kind of protection from the Iranian threats, which still exist as far as they are concerned, is not going to be there for the foreseeable future. Now, you hear US officials saying, we are not withdrawing. Politics is perception. And the perception today in the region is that the Americans, as we use the American presence or the American security umbrella, as they used to know and they used to rely on, will not be there in the near or foreseeable future.
I think that's a nice pivot point to my last question, but we're nearly 1 year into the Biden administration now. What have been your key takeaways so far when it comes to U.S. policy toward the region? What has and hasn't changed, and what surprised you the most?
Look, I think what it hasn't changed is that we still do not have an organizing principle for the U.S. policy in the Middle East. And partly it's because maybe it's a sign of the times. So with the Trump administration, we did not have that organizing principle. And we as experts of the Middle East, we're not surprised by the Trump administration not having an organizing principle. But a year in the Biden administration, there is still, I don't see still an organizing principle for their policies in the Middle East. We are hearing recently from US officials saying, they are back to basics. They are back to cooperation and alliance management and maintenance. But I think the Middle East is also different from when many of these officials used to be in government during the Obama administration. And I think there is a really need for some creative thinking and vision about how the US can reposition itself in the region in terms of addressing the needs of the region, the needs of the people of the region, helping the countries of the region, which have tremendous resources. Okay, not all of them, but the major, oil producer, having the resources that they could work with the US on helping the region move through this energy transition that it has to undertake in the next, 2-3 decades, and in helping the countries of the region manage their own conflicts. That has been also a major weakness of the region. The lack of perhaps an institutional conflict prevention, conflict reduction system and mechanisms, partly due to the fact that it is one of the few regions around the world that doesn't have a regional security architecture. And so the US also can help the countries of the region in coming together around putting this, region security architecture. During the height of the Cold War, every single US president, from President Eisenhower to George H.W. Bush, always met with their Soviet counterparts. The Soviet Union and the US and Western European countries always, during the highest moments of tension between them, worked on developing de-escalation mechanisms, eventually leading to the formation of the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In the Middle East, we don't have these norms. We don't have these mechanisms. For example, I don't know, I really forgot when was the last time that an Iranian leader, the supreme leader of Iran, met with the king of Saudi Arabia. These kind of meetings between leaders, this kind of constant communication not only at the leadership level, but also at the bureaucratic level, have been missing and are missing. And so it's very important that countries can help and can really help these countries come together in creating these mechanisms, in creating these norms going forward.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thank you so much for joining the program, Randa.
Thank you very much, Alistair.
Next up on the program, I'll be speaking with Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow at MEI and the Founding Director of the Defense and Security Program. He's also the author of the upcoming book, Rebuilding Arab Defense, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East, set to be released in April 2022. Bilal, it's great to have you on the program. Welcome back.
Hi, Alistair. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and thanks a lot for doing this.
Well, starting off, taking a look at the region through a sort of defense and security lens, what have been the key developments in 2021?
I think I would put at the very top Israel's inclusion into CENTCOM. I think it's a big deal, and how this opens up opportunities for greater U.S., Arab, Israeli security cooperation, which you started to see in the Gulf waters not too long ago with those combined naval drills that were conducted by the Americans, the Israelis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis. Another development that I can think of, which is, I think, more of a continuation of previous years, is the evolution of Saudi missile defense capabilities. You can safely say that Saudi Arabia is now the world's most experienced nation in the domain of missile defense, given the hundreds of attacks it has had to counter coming from Yemen. And even though the Saudi military campaign in Yemen has been a strategic failure by all objective accounts, missile defense in particular is a success story. Although now the question becomes, how sustainable is this success, given that the Saudis are running out of interceptor missiles? If you saw that story from not too long ago, I think it was in the New York Times. And of course, it costs a lot to continue to intercept missiles when those incoming missiles are super cheap, right? So those costs continue to be staggering for the Saudis. Third development is and this is a really interesting one, it's the operational use of suicide drones by Iran against U.S. forces in the region. I expect that to continue next year and evolve. And let's put aside for a moment why the Iranians launched that attack in southern Syria in October of this year, or what the circumstances of that attack were. But what matters is that they did it. They did it with a tool to which we have yet to develop an effective counter, technologically speaking. So if you recall, Alistair, on October 20th of this year, the Iranians used 5 armed drones to strike at an American base in southern Syria called Al-Tanf. Now, luckily, there were no casualties, but who knows? Next time there could be. And the point of the story is that Iran's military capabilities are fast developing, and this UAV capability gives them more operational flexibility in ways that could really complicate our posture in the region moving forward. And I'll just add one last one. I think it's an important development too. And I'm sure you tracked that one, Alistair, because it was just such a fascinating read in the New York Times. What an incredibly, almost impossible development to think of. But that's the Israeli remote-controlled assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, even though it happened in November of 2020, not this year. But this year, we discovered all the facts about that specific operation. I mean, just read that expose in the New York Times, which ran in September of this year, and it was updated a month later. And just tell me it doesn't remind you of like the Terminator movie, right? So, welcome to the age of artificial intelligence and warfare in the Middle East, which I expect to continue moving forward. Now, mind you, the Israeli machine gun that was used and that killed Fakhrizadeh was not an autonomous weapon. I mean, the Israelis still controlled it from an unknown location. God knows, maybe from inside Israel. But it was empowered by AI and robotics. It's an incredibly precise method to eliminate a target. And the Israelis, if you believe that story, they only used 15 bullets to kill the Iranian scientists. So, when time and distance place so few restrictions on your ability to engage your enemy, you can imagine what you can do with that technology, right? So the scary thing is that this all makes warfare in general and assassinations in particular easier to conduct. The silver lining, or the less scary thing, is that I guess you could just reduce civilian casualties because it is so precise.
Taking a slightly different lens on the year, what did you find most surprising in 2021?
It has to be the speed and ease with which unmanned aerial systems have been introduced in the Middle East and used in actual conflict. I mean, I had assumed that this would take a bit longer or that the technology wouldn't be as effective or accessible, but that's the world of defense we live in. It's much more open and liberalized, and it's just remarkable what you can buy off the shelf these days. So I think that's the most surprising, Alistair.
I think you kind of touched on this certainly in passing in your previous answer, but when it comes to the Middle East, when it comes to trends that are important, what are ones that people outside the defense policy community might not be aware of, but should be?
Yeah, so at the risk of repeating myself, I'll just say again, more sophisticated unmanned aerial systems, right, and their use in real life warfare, more precision, higher altitude, more persistence, more payload, more lethality drones, all of that, more AI. I mean, this is the future of warfare. And you've seen some of it already in not just the Middle East, but also in the latest Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And then a couple of years before that, or a year before that, in the fall of 2019, when the Iranians fired cruise missiles and drones at major Saudi oil facilities. So these are the trends that all the major defense industries are monitoring, are trying to fastly develop, and that governments, of course, are trying to find effective answers for.
Shifting gears, we're nearly 1 year into the Biden administration here in Washington. I wanted to get your kind of read on things. What has and hasn't changed when it comes to U.S. defense policy toward the region?
Yeah, sure. So the posture and the strategy are more or less the same. I mean, despite what you and I had discussed, I think it was last week, the new global posture review and the suggestion that more military resources used in the Middle East will be relocated to other priority regions, including the Indo-Pacific. I think our defense strategy will remain one that's centered on deterrence by denial, which means that we are going to continue to invest in stronger defenses, but we're going to struggle if deterrence fails. And if an attack happens, I don't think we have an answer to what we do then. So we don't have an element of deterrence by punishment yet. And we've seen that play out once again after the fall of 2019 and after various attacks by the Iranians, whether it's at sea or against our troops in southern Syria, as I mentioned to you before. There isn't that element of war fighting. And I'm not suggesting that we should go to war with Iran with every single attack, but there's got to be some kind of a deterrence to prevent the Iranians from continuing with these provocations, intimidations, attacks, so that things don't spiral out of control and don't actually lead to conflict.
On that point, on the issue of Iran, obviously tensions between Iran and the US and its allies in the region continue to be a central factor in shaping security dynamics. Talks in Vienna are ongoing, but it seems like the odds of a deal being reached are growing ever slimmer by the day. What's our plan B?
Yeah, I hope you're wrong about the decreasing possibility of a deal, but sadly, I think you are spot on. I don't think those chances are good, but just put that aside for a moment. So what's our plan B? Well, I don't know what plan B is. I don't really think the administration has publicly announced that they actually have one, unless I missed it. Maybe they do have one. They're keeping their cards close to their chest, but it's hard to believe that they actually have one, given all the private conversations that we've had with many representatives from the administration. So, I mean, let's just try to game this out a little bit. If the talks do fail, as you say, the Iranians can do one of two things, which certainly will have an effect on how we respond to one of those things. So they can either continue to enrich uranium at higher levels or stay where they are now. If they do option number one, so they continue to develop their nuclear capabilities, then it forces us to consider using means that are more aggressive than what we've used thus far. And that would include the use of force. We could add more sanctions, but I'm not sure what else we can sanction. I mean, we've pretty much sanctioned everything in the Iranian economy. Or we could pursue clandestine operations and cyber and what have you, but we've used that as well, and then it hasn't really done much. I mean, I've discussed with you before what the Israelis did as far as targeted assassinations of nuclear scientists, but that hasn't really stopped the Iranians from advancing their nuclear program. Now, if the Iranians stay put and do not advance their nuclear program, although with a huge caveat, I want to communicate, because it's very hard to verify really that, because they can hide their activities and our intel might not be able to detect it. But let's just assume that they stay put, okay? Then the administration will not be under tremendous pressure to consider alternative ways to push the Iranians to concede. And I don't know which scenario is going to play out, Alistair, but I can tell you this: it is becoming really hard to envision an outcome that will be satisfactory to us, to the Iranians, to the Israelis, and to our Arab partners. I mean, that's the complexity of this negotiation. This is not a bilateral negotiation. I'm not even mentioning the Russians and the Chinese, both of whom have very important roles to play, because the Chinese continue to buy Iranian oil at a discounted price, which in many ways sustains the Iranian economy, or at least allows the Iranians to survive. And that's a big problem for us because that evades the sanctions. So it's hard to find an outcome that pleases everybody. And some people, including the Israelis, and most importantly, the Israelis, just have a different threat assessment about what the Iranians present with their nuclear program. What we can tolerate is very different from what the Israelis, or to a lesser extent, the Arabs, can tolerate. The Israelis have very clearly communicated their red lines, and those include not just Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, but also achieving nuclear latency, which means, you have the capability to actually build the bomb, but you don't, right? So this is what we call in non-proliferation circles the Japan option, right? Japan could just build the bomb anytime it wants and very quickly, but it hasn't, for all sorts of reasons that have to do with strategic decisions and their alliance with us and so on and so forth. So you could see how the Israeli mindset and the Israeli threat assessment and strategic calculus vastly complicates our position and adds a sense of urgency to it.
Bilal, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on that we haven't covered so far? Any sort of final thoughts on the year?
I just want to say a couple things. One, the Gulf-Israeli security cooperation, it's not a question of if, but it's a question of when it's actually going to take off, like really take off. Now, I still think there'll be some limits to this cooperation because the Gulf states have to balance between improving security relations with the Israelis and not provoking the Iranians. So for now, Tehran is not that worried about the UAE and Bahrain and possibly others opening up to Israel. But if it starts detecting more serious forms, more tangible forms of cooperation that might facilitate an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear facilities, then it's an entirely different ballgame. And the Gulf states here have an opportunity to play their cards, or the Israeli card, right. And there are a lot of benefits in there, but there's no question that there are significant risks involved. I mean, just like there are risks in their association with us, the United States. So if you recall, the Iranians attacked Abqaiq in 2019 because of Trump's maximum pressure policy. It's not because of anything the Saudis did directly to them. So imagine if the Israelis use force against Iran or conduct another assassination against another high-value Iranian target, and then the Iranians somehow discovered that the Gulf states shared intelligence with the Israelis or facilitated that operation. I mean, you could easily see another version of Abqaiq in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi or elsewhere. And then the final point I want to say, which is more like a hopeful note, optimistic note, I just hope that whatever 2022 brings will be a lot more positive for regional security in the Middle East, and that we develop, us as a United States, a much more coherent strategy that explains to both our allies and our adversaries what the hell we're trying to do in that still vital part of the world. Because right now everybody's guessing and reaching the wrong conclusion that we are leaving the region, when in reality, I don't think we are. We just happen to be very unclear about what we're doing with that presence that we retain in the region.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Bilal. We'll have to leave things there.
You're most welcome. Thank you, Alistair.
Next up on the program, I'll be speaking to Karen Young, Senior Fellow and Founding Director of MEI's Program on Economics and Energy. Karen, welcome back to the podcast, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair. Good to be with you.
Starting out with a sort of macro-level view of the region, what have been the most important economic and trends and developments in the Middle East this year?
Well, 2021 has been, the year of recovery that has been in fits and starts, right? And so I think the overall trend that we've seen in the economies across the Middle East is just that it's economies, right? A lot of divergence, really a lot of unequal reactions in terms of government's ability to provide stimulus, to prepare for recovery. And that's going to play out in different ways, of course, among countries that are oil exporters and countries that are importers. So really, disaggregation, differences in access to capital, differences in reliance on oil and gas revenues, but also in terms of reliance on, the kinds of revenue receipts from tourism, for example, which, puts a lot of countries in a difficult position.
Drilling down into that in just a little bit more detail, as you said, obviously the recovery is playing out in very different ways across the region. Are there any countries or regions within the broader Middle East that have stood out for their performance, either positive or negative?
Yeah, so I mean, the GCC states are really leading the recovery in terms of the resumption of GDP growth. They're better positioned than what we see perhaps in North Africa or across the Levant. And this, of course, has to do with the rise in oil prices towards the end of this year. But also, you could argue in terms of government capacity, these are states that did well during the pandemic in terms of the rollout of vaccinations, the ability to, enforce lockdowns and mobility restrictions on their populations. And at the same time, some really surprising resilience, I would say. I mean, the Saudi economy is come out as the big winner of 2021. They were able to, at the same time, have a pretty orthodox fiscal policy where they tightened down on spending, but at the same time created a lot of domestic demand within their economy. So people, Saudis were consuming. And at the same time, tax rates were quite high. The value-added tax at 15% generated almost half as much revenue for the Saudi government as their oil receipts in 2021. So they're coming out of this year, I think, feeling quite confident. They've reduced their budget deficit. They have had good access to capital. They've reduced their spending. I mean, they've cut the public sector wage bill. They've cut military spending. So they're well positioned for what happens next year.
Here in the US, we've been hearing a lot about the effects of inflation and supply chain disruptions. To what extent are those issues affecting the Middle East as well? And what are the greatest economic challenges for the region right now?
Yeah, I think this is the big unknown, particularly going into 2022, is what the impact of inflation will be across emerging markets. And so, there are some silver linings, even in the cases which are struggling. Take Turkey, for example, really, really high inflation, basically a currency crisis at this point. But one thing it has done is boost Turkish exports because they're cheaper in comparison to other goods. So, there's some good signs in the Turkish economy, despite, having a very, very bad inflationary problem. What that will mean, as we kind of look forward, is that countries that are, seeking external financings, whether it's borrowing from banks or issuing bonds, they're going to pay more for that capital. And if you have a deteriorating, currency value and your borrowing is priced in dollars, that begins to get expensive. So they're going to pay more for it in the short term, and they'll pay more for it over, the course of the life of that loan.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, but oil producers, especially in the Gulf, have benefited from the steady increase in prices over the course of the year, especially towards the end of the year. And the OPEC Plus agreement has held, although there were some significant disputes between members over the course of the year. Do you think we're likely to see more of those sort of disputes moving forward, especially as dynamics in the market change?
So OPEC Plus is holding, and the most recent agreement is basically to maintain the 400,000 barrel a day increase. What's interesting, and there's a lot of kind of, I think, misunderstandings of the politics of what role the United States had in that decision to carry forward the production increases, is that most or many of the OPEC Plus members are currently not meeting their quotas. So this is true in Russia, this is true in Nigeria. And so production, on paper looks like it's increasing and it's strong, but in perhaps practice, it is still a little bit weak. And so this is a measure of protection in thinking about where, the variants of COVID might take us in the next quarter. We don't really know. And so there's a little bit of still kind of holding back on OPEC Plus production that's happening right now. You're right. There were disagreements in July of 2021, particularly between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, in terms of ramping up production, with the UAE having more interest and momentum in getting product to market. That seems to have settled down, and the UAE will probably be better positioned, I suppose, to meet higher production quotas in the new year. But there are different strategies among oil exporters, particularly in dominating market share to Asia. And so this is more competition among the GCC states. It's going to play out in different ways. I think there's also different time horizons and ways of thinking about the energy transition among the GCC exporters. And so, how they maneuver into other new products, particularly renewable products, we'll see more competition among them in that sense as well.
Wanted to touch on that in a little bit more detail, the issue of the global energy transition and the role of the Middle East and all of that. I know that's one of the big things that you've focused on over the course of this year. Where do things stand on that front more broadly, and what were the kind of key developments this year in that space?
Well, sort of like the comments, how we started, the economies of the region, a lot of divergence, and the same thing in terms of transitions. It's a plural, right? That's going to be experienced in different ways with some really different capacities across the region. So, the program at MEI, we're very focused on how governments and national oil companies are positioning themselves as energy companies and getting into new businesses, whether it's hydrogen or whether it's solar power, and the way that really very giant firms like the Aramcos and ADNOCs of the world and associated entities of sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf states are able to then deploy that technology, those resources, that know-how to the broader region and building, new power plants or potentially exporting new kinds of fuel capacities, whether that's like potentially a green hydrogen fuel. So that's where some of the region is headed. In other parts of the region, for example, in Egypt, we're seeing a positioning in kind of the intermediate transition. And this is about the gas business. So it's going to be very, very important for countries that have gas potential to make the most of a period of time in which LNG will be a preferred hydrocarbon because it's cleaner, and to get that product to market. So that means, getting the money for exploration, for new production, for new infrastructure, for liquefaction plants, and particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think, again, the theme is really variation of accessibility of resources, disaggregation within the region of those that have the potential to engage the transition in these various phases. And I would think of the right now phase is where oil markets are and getting that market share. The next one is that intermediary, particularly the gas business, and then the third one is in the renewables. So for the businesses and the countries that have the capacity to be in all three, good for them. But some are, having to sort of pick and choose. And that's going to be really interesting to watch, but it's obviously creates some disadvantages for some.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on that we haven't covered so far? Any kind of final thoughts?
Oh, gosh. I think one thing 2021 has taught us is we just don't know. We thought we were coming out of COVID, that we're going to see the resumption of air travel and of, easing of logistics and going back to normal. And I don't think anyone now remembers what normal looked like. Now we're just getting used to disruptions. We're getting used to the idea of new variants, of being flexible in our planning. And the same is true for governments, right? So in sort of projecting where you will be 2, 3, 4 quarters from now is getting more difficult. And so the things that you want to look for are probably more conservative kind of fiscal planning. I think that will be a trend. Governments are going to be a little bit more careful with their spending. For those that need to borrow, they're going to be pressed. It's going to be more difficult for some. So that's going to define, I think, a lot of the politics and perhaps reform agendas in the region in the next year or so.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Karen.
Thank you.
That's our program for today. I'd like to thank all of our guests from across MEI, as well as our production team for their work on this special year-end episode. You can follow all of MEI's year-end review coverage on our website at www.mei.edu. We'll be off for the next few weeks and back again in January. Happy holidays.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.